China has a plan to dominate the South China Sea, and it's not your average military maneuver. If Beijing follows through, it risks going to war with 5 nations simultaneously over one of the world's most strategic waterways. But it doesn't stop there. This plan could extend beyond the sea, triggering a chain reaction that pulls in major powers and potentially ignites World War III. The South China Sea has been a hotspot of territorial disputes for decades. China claims nearly the entire sea as its own, but it's not the only one with a stake. Vietnam, the Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, and Indonesia all have competing claims and strongly oppose Beijing's aggressive push to expand deeper into those contested waters. It all started in January 1974. That's when the Chinese occupied the Paracel Islands, kicking out Vietnamese forces in the process. These islands aren't especially important from a land ownership perspective. Most of the 130 islands are coral reefs, making them almost useless in terms of housing people or setting up any defined military presence. None exceed more than a single square mile in size. However, their location is what matters. The islands are around 250 miles east of central Vietnam and 220 miles southeast of China's Hainan Island. That puts the islands smack bang in the middle of 2 countries that want to use them to expand their territorial holdings in the South China Sea. More clashes between China and Vietnam followed in the years following China's attempts to claim the Paracel Islands. In March 1988, the navies of the 2 countries clashed, and Vietnam came out on the losing end. 64 of its sailors were killed in the skirmish. That fight happened after China turned its attention to the Spratly Islands. Like the Paracels, the Spratlys are seemingly inconsequential in terms of their size and ability to house people. However, they are in a strategically significant location, being north of Malaysia and about midway between Vietnam and the Philippines. That location means that they are claimed either wholly or in part by several nations. China's actions in 1988 were an attempt to use military force to claim the Spratlys. Vietnam pushed back as it did in the Paracels over a decade earlier. By now, you're likely starting to see a pattern form. China positions itself as the aggressor in the South China Sea by trying to claim territory to which it has no rights. That angers one of the smaller nations involved in the South China Sea dispute, principally Vietnam in the 70s and 80s, which led to conflict. In 1994, the establishment of the United Nations Conventions on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, was supposed to resolve that conflict. UNCLOS provided a legal framework defining maritime jurisdiction, including creating definitions for territorial seas and exclusive economic zones, or EEZs. We'll come back to EEZs soon. The important thing to know about UNCLOS is that China was one of the first of 169 countries to sign the treaty, which it also ratified 2 years after the United Nations introduced it. The South China Sea conflict should have ended there. Instead, China has tried to twist UNCLOS to its own ends while breaking the treaty multiple times over the years. Tensions escalated even after the introduction of UNCLOS. In 1995, China seized control of Mischief Reef, just off the coast of the Philippine island of Palawan, sparking a brief naval clash with Philippine forces. Years later, in November 2022, China appeared to ease its stance by signing an informal agreement with members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. Much like UNCLOS, this agreement was designed to establish rules of conduct among the nations with competing claims in the South China Sea. Again, China couldn't stop itself from breaking the agreement. April 2012 saw China once again coming into conflict with the Philippines, this time over the Scarborough Shoal. The Philippines attempted to arrest Chinese fishermen in the area. It failed. China asserted control over the shoal 3 months later, and so it has continued in the South China Sea for decades. China attempts land grabs, and sometimes it succeeds. Every single one of these moves is designed to allow China to extend its territorial claims in the South China Sea. But here is the most terrifying thing. Land grabs are only a small part of China's plan to attack 5 nations at once. Far more terrifying are the other 2 parts of the plan: the Great Wall of Sand and the 9-Dash Line. China's forcible attempts to claim island clusters and shoals in the South China Sea are all about territory. By owning those islands, China also owns the coastlines around them and the EEZs that come with that ownership. However, these islands aren't enough to justify China's claim to the entire South China Sea. So what do you do when there are no more islands to claim, but you want to keep boosting your territorial rights? You build your own islands. And that's what China is doing with its Great Wall of Sand. In late 2013, China started construction on several military islands in the South China Sea. Those islands are not only man-made, but they lie within the borders of several of the nations with which China is battling for control over the massive body of water. By March 2022, 3 of the islands that China built were militarized. The Guardian says that the trio of islands were already home to anti-aircraft and anti-ship missile systems by that time. There were also Chinese fighter jets and special laser and jamming equipment intended to make it harder for any opponents to kick them off the islands. Former U.S. Indo-Pacific Commander Admiral John C. Aquilino summed it up perfectly. Over the past 20 years, we've witnessed the largest military buildup since World War II by the PRC, or the People's Republic of China. They have advanced all their capabilities, and the buildup of weaponization is destabilizing the region. Beyond the military buildups on China's man-made islands, there are now 40 ships stationed at Fiery Cross and the Spratly Islands. U.S. planes also note that China is building warehouses, ports, runways, and radars on all the islands it claims to own. These aren't the actions of a nation that's attempting to protect its own sovereign rights. They're the actions of a country that is preparing for war. And then there's the 9-dash line, also known as the U-shaped line and the dotted line. The 9-dash line is a visual representation of the territory China claims to own in the South China Sea. It also just so happens to support Beijing's claim to having control over the Spratly and Paracel Islands, along with, well, practically every other physical body of land in the South China Sea. The line runs along the coasts of all 5 of the countries that are in China's crosshairs right now. It's essentially stating that those countries only have control over their immediate coastlines. The rest of the South China Sea belongs to China. The 9-dash line is as clear a representation as any of China's desire to control the region. It also demonstrates how China is attempting to twist the territorial and EEZ laws that we mentioned earlier. UNCLOS plays a key role in this dispute. Under international law, every coastal nation has full sovereignty over the waters extending 12 nautical miles from its shoreline. Within this zone, the state controls access and can allow or eject foreign vessels at will. Beyond that lies the Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ, a 200 nautical mile stretch where a nation holds exclusive rights to natural resources like oil, gas, and fish, but not full territorial control. It's via EEZs that countries like Vietnam and the Philippines mark their claims in the South China Sea. These EEZs are also what China uses to enforce its claims. How? Well, the answer brings us back to the Great Wall of Sand. Every tiny island that China claims in the South China Sea theoretically becomes its territory, getting its own 12 nautical mile sovereign zone along with a 200 nautical mile EEZ. Despite the largest of the paracels being around 1 square mile, the full island cluster occupies 5,800 square miles of the South China Sea. That ratio is insane. A total of almost 3 square miles of land potentially gives China access to thousands of square miles of water. We see a similar situation in the Spratlys. China tries to take advantage of the dozens of tiny islands to stake a massive claim in the South China Sea. It used force to gain those islands, and the 5 nations now opposing China say that it has no right to own those islands, meaning that it can't make the EEZ claim it makes. The entire situation is a complicated mess for every country involved, and that is what makes it a powder keg that could ignite World War III. But why is the South China Sea so special that China is willing to start a fight with 5 other countries to get at it? Well, there are several reasons, starting with the historical. China claims that the concerns of its 5 South China Sea neighbors don't mean anything because China has owned the water for centuries. History certainly shows that Chinese ships have been sailing through the waters since at least the 2nd century. China uses those records to claim that its ownership of the South China Sea dates back to the Han Dynasty. By the time of the Song Dynasty, rolling around in 960, China says that it was claiming and naming many of the islands that now make up the Spratlys and Paracels. The problem with this historical claim is simple. What may have been true in the past doesn't reflect what's happening today. While China may have exerted influence over parts of the South China Sea up until the 19th century, that control began to erode with time. The arrival of Western explorers during that era chipped away at China's maritime dominance, and the rise of Vietnam's Nguyen Dynasty further challenged its regional claims. China also endured long stretches when foreign powers, including Japan, controlled portions of its territory, weakening its broader influence across the region. If history is their argument, it's clear that several other nations can point to their own pasts to bolster their South China Sea claims. However, it's not really history that matters to China despite all its claims. Instead, the South China Sea conflict comes down to one thing that so often leads to nations going to war: money. Specifically, money generated via trade and access to natural resources. On the trade front, about a third of all global shipping passes through the South China Sea. Vessels traveling to and from China, Japan, South Korea, and a host of smaller nations all rely on the Strait of Malacca, which links the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean, to transport goods. The numbers are staggering. Back in 2016, CSIS estimated that around $3.37 trillion worth of trade passed through the South China Sea. About $874 million of that trade involved exports from China. As for the rest, that came from nations as varied as the 5 against which China is planning to act, along with Japan, Singapore, and even Germany. Even then, some believe that the $3.37 trillion is a conservative estimate. The actual number could be closer to $5.3 trillion, with about $1.2 trillion of that trade being between nations in the South China Sea and the United States. Either way, you're likely getting an idea of why China wants to control that massive waterway. If China owns the South China Sea, it also sets the trade rules. It could implement exporting taxes on all of its neighbors, potentially pouring billions of dollars into China's coffers annually. China also would be able to hold a third of global trade hostage in its ongoing trade war with the United States if it permanently stakes its claim to the South China Sea. The scenario is easy to envision. The United States employs sanctions or new tariffs on China, who responds by shutting off the South China Sea, preventing other nations from using it. This would force them to take much longer routes to the US and their other trading partners. China either gets to make billions of dollars or cost other countries billions. Either way, control over the South China Sea is massive for China when it comes to trade. Add to all of this trade control the massive oil and other natural resources the South China Sea is believed to contain. According to the Environmental Investigation Agency, or EIA, the U.S. Geological Survey believes that the South China Sea contains 13 basins that contain valuable natural resources. These include 2.4 billion and 9.2 billion barrels of petroleum and anywhere between 62 and 216 trillion cubic feet, or TCF, of untapped gas. In early May 2025, a single barrel of crude oil was selling for around $62. Multiply that by the 2.4 billion barrels believed to be in the South China Sea, and you get $148 billion. On the gas front, U.S. consumers paid $15.95 per 1,000 cubic feet of gas in 2023. That amounts to a massive $15.95 billion per TCF of natural gas. If China has full control, it could lead to it potentially having access to between $989 billion and $3.4 trillion of natural gas. No wonder the rest of the world is worried. Of course, there are caveats to all of this. Resources being available in the South China Sea and gaining access to those resources are two very different things. China would have to invest heavily to build the equipment it needs to access all of that oil and natural gas in the South China Sea's basins. It knows that. China also knows that new technology in the future could make these abundant resources easier to access, so it wants control now, both to stake its claim to those resources and prevent other countries, especially the 5 against which it's preparing to fight, to gain access. There's a whole lot of money riding on the South China Sea control, regardless of whether you look at the trade or the natural resource aspects of the equation. By now, China's plan is clear. It manipulates international shipping laws by claiming control over islands it doesn't own. To justify itself, China relies on ancient history and its 9-dash line to lay claim to the South China Sea. It's also willing to fight for what it wants, engaging in skirmishes to gain the island control that reinforces its claims. And to cap it all off, where islands aren't available for China to take over, it simply builds its own, militarizes them, and then tries to claim the waters around them. Now we're starting to see China start to push its control of the waterway. Nowhere is that more obvious than in the Philippines. On April 28, 2025, both China and the Philippines displayed their nation's flags in Sandy Cay. The island is one of the many in the disputed Spratly Islands cluster, with both countries claiming the flag unfurling showcases their sovereign rights to the island. While these actions seem petty, they come on the back of China showing increased aggression toward the Philippines. In both April and December of 2024, Chinese vessels used water cannons to damage Philippine ships. The April incident took place just 130 miles from the Scarborough Shoal coast. The attack saw China damage a ship that was en route to deliver supplies to Filipino Marines. In December, China got even more aggressive. In addition to firing water cannons, it blockaded and even sideswiped ships that were on a routine patrol in Scarborough Shoal. Tensions are rising between China and the Philippines. However, China isn't shy about turning its attention to the other 4 nations that dispute its claims to the control of the South China Sea. Vietnam is also being forced to deal with the Chinese problem. Back in April 2020, China sank a Vietnamese fishing vessel with 8 crew members close to the Paracel Islands. China might have tried to claim that the incident was an accident, but if it did, that wouldn't explain why it grew even more aggressive with Vietnamese fishers in September of 2024. That month saw the Chinese Navy launch an attack on a Vietnamese fishing vessel, injuring 10 people in the process. Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei are also having to deal with China's increased aggression. Malaysia's fight with China hasn't gotten physical yet. However, it refused to recognize the standard map that China released in the summer of 2023, featuring the 9-dash line. More recently, Malaysia's been dangling the prospect of bilateral talks over the hydrocarbons in the South China Sea in front of China. Beijing isn't going for it. Talks mean nothing when China's determined to take those hydrocarbons by force, if necessary. It may not be long before we see similar attacks on Malaysian vessels as we've seen against the Philippines and Vietnam. Brunei is also trying to go down the diplomatic route. It has to. The kingdom is tiny, and it represents no threat to China. If anything, China may attempt to use Brunei as a lever to expand its influence over the other 4 nations that are in its crosshairs. After all, its Sultan, Hassan al-Bolkiah, has visited China 13 times since 1967, with the most recent visit coming in February 2025. China could use Brunei by promising economic growth in return for Brunei's support in the South China Sea. And then there's Indonesia. That country isn't willing to stand back and watch as China tries to take control of the South China Sea. It proved that back in June 2016, when one of its naval vessels fired on a Chinese fishing boat that ventured into Indonesian waters. That attack marked the 3rd confrontation between the 2 nations in 2016, and tensions haven't simmered down since then. The point here is simple. China is clashing with everyone in the South China Sea. It's not just making claims. China is willing to fight for what it claims to belong to the country. And that willingness to fight makes the South China Sea the potential catalyst for World War III. Control of the South China Sea means control over the vital trade routes and rich natural resources. If China succeeds in overpowering the 5 opposing nations, it would gain massive strategic and economic leverage. The U.S. in particular has a vested interest. Over $1 trillion in American trade passes through the South China Sea every year. It certainly doesn't want China to become a player in the natural resources sphere or to become a nation that determines what nations can sail through the South China Sea. That means the U.S. and potentially its allies could come to the 5 nations' defense if China gets serious with attacks. Alliances between the 5 and other nations could also be a trigger. Popular Mechanics says it's not just the U.S. that wants to curb China's influence in the South China Sea. Canada, Australia, Japan, India, and the UK all have interests they want to protect. China, for its part, says this combination of countries, along with the 5 in the South China Sea, are trying to isolate the nation. China also announced that it would start using a law to arrest any foreign nationals sailing in the South China Sea back in the summer of 2024. If it uses that law to target somebody from the wrong country, such as the US, we may get a trigger for World War III. But what it ultimately comes down to is China's growing influence. Taking the South China Sea and its plans for attacking 5 nations is part of China's wider goal of exerting its full influence over the Indo-Pacific. Far too many players, including the US and Japan, can't allow that to happen. When South China Sea tensions erupt into a full-blown conflict with the 5, China will find itself dealing with many more countries than the comparatively weak nations it's targeting. As for the rest of the world, it'll face a global war for which it isn't ready. Do you think China would actually go through with its plans, or is this just posturing? And if they did, how should the world respond? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Now go check out the US plan if China takes Taiwan, or click on this video instead.